Hey everybody. So you might be looking through the videos this week and go, there's no word of the week video. And that's true. I did not make a word of the week video yet. However, I will be finishing the Lost Trilogy series. It's just going to take a little bit longer. We have some things going on at the church with doing in-person services. I'm helping with the live stream there. I'm helping with the worship, things like that. It's just there's a lot of things on my plate. And so I want to make sure I do it right. And in doing so, it's going to take a little bit longer. However, we're not going to stop doing videos. We're not going to stop talking about the Lost Trilogy series. We're really going to start focusing on the Prodigal Son and really break down that story so that when you do watch that video, hopefully it just connects even more. Because a lot of times when we have stories that we know, we are comfortable with, we've maybe read many times, well, we sometimes gloss over it. We go, oh, I've heard that story 100 times before. Well, I want to look at this story new. I want you guys to look at this story in a way that goes, oh, I've never seen that before, or take it at a different light or a different angle so that it'll help us see things a little bit clearer, maybe connect with us a little bit better as we read it, for the 100th time, or maybe for the first time, whatever it might be. So the first thing we want to look at is the word prodigal and the character of the son. Just to help you understand, Jesus is talking to these Pharisees and he's frustrated at them. He uses this story, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but he uses this story and he has three characters in it. The younger son, the father, and the older son. And each of these characters represents something specific Jesus is trying to show. So today we're going to look at who the son is and what he's supposed to be in our lives, and what the word prodigal means. So, going with prodigal here, if you were to ask people what prodigal meant, like, here, I need something to be able to throw up on the screen so that you can understand what I'm talking about. So we're going to use this dry erase board, and we're going to throw up prodigal here. It's Prodigal. That's just kidding. It's Prodigal. Prodigal. So if you were to ask someone, what does prodigal mean? It's a very unique word. Probably many of them will go, I don't know. If you ask them how to spell it, they might even go, I don't know. And that's probably pretty common because prodigal is not a very common word. It's, I guess you could say, a Bible word for the most part. Doesn't mean it was a Bible word all the time, like substitutionary atonement and redemption and things like that. But prodigal was used many, many years ago, and now it's just not something we use a lot. So a lot of people don't really know what it means. So we want to be able to understand, what does that mean? So some people might say, I don't know. Others might respond with, well, the story has to do with a son who leaves and then gets lost. So prodigal and lost, maybe it means prodigal and lost. So prodigal means lost. Well, others might look at the story slightly different and go, okay, so it has to do with a kid who goes, takes the money and goes, and he does stupid things and he's reckless with this. So prodigal means reckless or stupid. Well, the last answer is a little more correct. But the second answer, being lost, is pretty common for people to say. And it's an easy mistake because of that correlation between lost and prodigal in the story. We need to remember that the story is the end of a 3-parable trilogy. It's kind of a culmination of what Jesus is trying to teach these Pharisees and the people listening around them. Because just before he begins his 3 stories, we have the Pharisees. In the beginning of Luke 15, we have the Pharisees, and they're being a little, in my opinion, annoying, a little mouthy. And they're looking at all the people surrounding Jesus, and they're frustrated and say, oh, well, Jesus hangs out with these tax collectors and sinners. And these sinners in this situation just kind of is that catch-all. Sometimes it means sinners. Sometimes it just means people who aren't Jewish, like Samaritans. But in any case, these Pharisees are saying Jesus is hanging out with people that you shouldn't even be near because just the mere thought of being next to them might make you sinful. And so they're getting a little, like I said, mouthy about it all. And Jesus hears that. And so he responds. A lot of times when he is asked a question or sees something in a situation, he likes to respond with a story. And so he goes, all right, I want to tell you a few stories here. And he begins with a lost coin, and then the lost sheep, and then, lastly, the lost son. So, of course, when we see the lost son, it can get us mixed up with prodigal being lost, because a lot of times the story is titled either the lost son or the prodigal son, so a lot of times we interchange those words. But the reality is, prodigal doesn't mean lost. What does prodigal mean? Well, prodigal is the English word. But let's look at the Greek word. It's asotos, which is alpha, sigma, omega, theta, and sigma. That's what those words mean. Here it is as the Greek, and here it is as the transliterated word. So this word here actually means extravagant and wasteful. So if you were to look at what this son did, is he took his father's inheritance and then he spent it in an extravagant and wasteful way. And that's what it means. He threw money at things that weren't worth throwing money at. He went to parties. He did excessive things like excessive drinking and maybe gambling and whatever it might be. He didn't think about being responsible. Instead, he only went off what he wanted and to the excess, to the point where he actually ran out rather quickly with his father's inheritance. And then he ended up without any money, without any shelter, without any food. He was lost. And he didn't know what to do or who to turn to. And we see that in the story, and we'll look at that again a little bit later. That story of just like his understanding of all of that and how he dealt with it. But in any case, often we see stories like this in the Bible. We see these stories of Jesus trying to explain a parable, or we see just the regular Bible stories, the big stories that we see in the Old Testament, and we end up just going, this son is wasteful, he did bad things, and then his father forgave him, and so we need to learn about how, we should be smart about our money and that we should forgive people. And yes, that's the very base answer to that story, but there's more to it. We can't just read through it real quick like we've read through it real quick our whole lives. We see the message, but then don't take it to heart. We just see a little bit of it and not the whole thing. Many times when we read about this particular story, we look at it from the outside in. We look at it as a 21st century Christian, or even non-Christian, depends on who you are, looking at a story about these first century Jewish people and these Pharisees and these other sinners surrounding Jesus. And we look at a 21st century Christian looking at this story versus that first century person. And we need to remember that the life, the situations, and all of that are so different for someone that was listening directly to Jesus than we would, with phones and electricity and a completely different way of life. But what if? What if we were to take ourselves and put ourselves in that situation? Now, you might look at it and go, well, I've never asked for inheritance from my parents before they passed away. And I never blew it on dumb things to buy and excessive parties and extra things that are worthless. But we need to remember, just because he tells that story doesn't mean that that's 100% what it's always about. It's a parable. It's a moral lesson to help us understand things about the world and our lives and about a relationship with God. To be honest, to be prodigal does not have to be someone who took money from their parents, went off into another country, spent it all, and got lost. That's not what it has to be. Because prodigal is just about wasteful and excessive living. And so, to be prodigal, you just have to live in a way that puts worthless things above important things. So maybe look at your life and you love video games. Maybe you have put video games above spending time with your family or reading your Bible or doing homework. Those things that are more, yes, they are more important than video games. Or maybe you're someone who's put money or travel above going to church and being with a Christian community or helping those around you because you want to spend time traveling the world or doing these specific things, these expensive things to kind of not think about life. When you blow your time and your money on things that are not important, you live a prodigal life. Doesn't mean that you can't spend time and money on things like video games and travel. But it's when it becomes the excessive part of your life, the majority of your life is spent on those worldly, not so helpful things, that it becomes prodigal. And in the end, you may not be physically lost or destitute, but we need to remember the story is meant to focus on not necessarily the physical, but the spiritual as well. And in every story Jesus is telling, he always really wants us to get the spiritual point of the story. And so, quite often people can seem well off in a physical sense, but then completely be lost in a spiritual sense. To help us understand that, Jesus, I'll throw it up on the board, in Matthew 6, verse 19, this is the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said this, and I think this helps us tie in this idea of prodigal, excessive, wasteful living, and really what our focus should be on. It says in verse 19, "Don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but instead store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So, we need to remember what is truly important. The spiritual and the physical both intertwine within our lives. We are physical and spiritual beings. We have to focus on both of them for living. I have to eat food to be able to survive, but I also have to be spiritually strong by reading and praying and things like that. So it's intertwined in our lives, but we also need to remember that the spiritual is where our true focus needs to be. Yes, we can have fun with the physical. We can go and have fun with friends. We can go and eat this really neat food here. We can go and buy this really fun game here. But what is our true focus? What is our main focus? It needs to be on God. A good and godly spiritual life reflects a good physical life. But a worldly physical life does not always reflect a good spiritual life. So what is your focus on? And I think there's 3 points we can kind of get out from this story and this idea that Jesus is trying to help us understand what prodigal means. When we live our lives in wasteful and extravagant ways, a few things happen. 1, we forget what it means to balance our lives. Oh man, you look at the world today and it's out of balance. Politics is out of balance. Just the normal everyday living is out of balance. God wants us to live in balance. That's why I said we are intertwined. We are both physical and spiritual beings. We have to have a balance within us to be able to say, I'm not going to spend my whole life studying the Word but never living it out. Because if I study the Bible here, if I read this book front to back, end up memorizing the whole thing, but never once take an opportunity to put this into physical practice, what's the point? What is the point? Because we need to have balance. But at the same time, if I take this book and throw it away and never use it again, and I only live off of my own desires and everything, then also what is the point? We need to have a balance. We need to understand that the spiritual is the important thing we base our life off of, but the physical is also there because we need to help others, and we need to help our physical bodies to be able to continue to live out those spiritual lessons that we are taught. We can spend time and money on things that we enjoy, of course. But when we blow it on unnecessary things all the time and never take time to focus on our spiritual connection with others and with God, then we've lost. We are lost. 2, we lose sight on God. So 1, we forget what it means to have balance in our lives, and then we lose sight on God. When we, like I said, when we take that balance and we throw it aside and we say, well, yeah, I learned this when I was younger, but I don't want it anymore. When you stop having a connection with someone that you are friends with or even family with, and you stop talking to them and connecting with them, you forget them. They fade away. It's the same thing with our relationship with God. If we don't actively focus on a stronger relationship with God, eventually we lose sight of God. We lose sight on the things that are healthy and important to help us build a better life, both physical and spiritual. But even more so, we begin to turn from God and what He has called us to be. And instead, we focus on ourselves. And that gets to our 3rd point. Number 3, we live an attitude of selfishness. If you're only focusing on the things you want rather than on those around you or on God, then what are you doing? How are you living a fulfilled life? A balanced, fulfilled life if all you're doing is focusing on yourself. Because in the end, if you look at your life and you realize you don't have a balance in your life, you're not really looking at God, and you are living a selfish life, then you are living a prodigal life. And you're wasting it on worldly things. On things where moth and rust will destroy, where thieves will break in and steal, but instead we need to focus on God and what He gives us. Where is your treasure? Where is your focus? Where do you put most of your time and effort in? Well, the prodigal son, and as we read that story, and I encourage you every time you watch this video, not this video, but all these videos in order. Read the prodigal son. It's a short story. It's not that long. Read Luke 15. The prodigal son lived a life of selfishness. And in the end, spent his life on worthless things until he finally realized what was important. Doesn't mean that he couldn't have had friends and had fun and still focused on his family and on God. But the problem is that he put everything above God. And even more so, he replaced God and his family with worldly, breakable, and in the end, worthless things. And so he became lost. And so if we focus and replace God with things of this world, we will be lost. And that is what the story is trying to say. That is what Jesus is trying to focus on in that particular aspect of the prodigal side of this story. But next week, we're going to talk about the Father and the idea of redemption and forgiveness through the Father to his Son. But until we talk again, I hope you can evaluate or reevaluate your life and see how you're living. Are you living in a way that is wasteful, reckless, and prodigal? Or are you living a life with a focus on God, where you are balancing that physical and spiritual life? And are you trying to live in a way that God has called us to live and be? And if you need a short little saying that you can kind of run through your head to think about, okay, how do I balance that physical and spiritual side of things? Well, remember what I always say at the end of all my Tadbit videos. We are called to share Jesus, which is take what we've learned and live it out in the world through how we say and how we act, and show his love in all that we do. So until next time, share Jesus and show his love.